You hear from creationists a lot, look at all the flood stories, look at all the flood myths around the world, let's look how common they are. And they're all by these sort of river valley civilizations or people groups that are, of course, living in a condition that would merit knowing what floods are. Curiously, the Egyptians don't seem to have the early and middle kingdom or either of the intermediate periods. I don't think they. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Joss, but I don't think they have an equivalent sort of flood story, which is quite strange considering the inundation.
So Custance talks about this. Arthur Custance in The Flood, Local or Global, page 62 and 3. And he says, the Egyptians did, however, have a tradition which might very well be a recollection of the deluge, transmuted into an intelligible form from their point of view. The great god Ra once assembled the other gods and said, behold the men which have been begotten by myself, they utter words against me. Tell me what you would do in such a case. Behold, I have waited and have not slain them before listening to their words, their defense. The gods replied, let thy face permit it, and let those men who devise wicked things be smitten, and let none among them survive. So the goddess named Hathor went forth among them, and slew the men upon the earth. And behold, Sekhet for many nights trod with his feet in their blood, even to the city of Hierapolis. The anger of Ra is appeased by an offering comprised of 7,000 pitchers of liquor made from fruit mixed with human blood. When Ra saw the vases, he said, it is well, I shall protect men because of this. I lift my hand in regard to this and declare that I shall no more slay mankind. In the middle of the night he commanded the vases to be turned over. The result was a great flood, which was regarded as a sign of returning favor. And that quote comes from John Urquhart, The Testimony of Tradition to the Flood. And right here's the reference, if you want to look into that. And this comes from Arthur Custance. This book is available online, and perhaps I'll try to look this up and link it below. But there's indication of perhaps a flood tradition of some sort from Egypt. And Custance goes on to point this out. In his commentary on Genesis, Skinner, very important scholar, Skinner notes that in 1904, Edouard Neville claimed to have found fresh proof of an Egyptian flood tradition in a text from the Book of the Dead, which contained the following words. And further, I, the god Tum, am going to deface all I have done. This earth will become an ocean through an inundation, as it was at the beginning. Okay, and I happen to have Skinner here from his critical commentary, page 174 and 5, where indeed he talks about this a bit. Neville claims to have found fresh proof of an Egyptian tradition in a text of the Book of the Dead, containing the following words. And further, I, the god Tum, am going to deface all I have done. This earth will become water, or an ocean, through an inundation, as it was at the beginning. And so there's indication of perhaps knowledge of a deluge among the Egyptians. But that's not the main reason I know the Egyptians were familiar with the flood. You know how I know the Egyptians were familiar with the flood? It's because Moses informs us to that effect. How so? The reason we know that, this comes from page 7 of my book. The reason we know Egypt was familiar with the flood is because Moses has them to be receivers of Edenic families. And so knowledge of the flood would have indeed been reflected in their understanding. And that's what the Table of Nations is. These are the people that knew about the flood, the giants, the garden, and other issues like that. Now, Erica here, this young lady speaking, she has a special interest in this particular issue. And it comes out again quite a bit later in this video I'm using, but I'm gonna move this quotation from her up closer here and deal with it because it's a related issue. So look at the point she raises later in the video, though. Listen to what she says here.
This is a big sticking point for me. You know, they'll sit and they'll say, look at all these places that have flood myths. Okay, what about the ones that don't? Right?
They forgot.
And there are a lot of them. I mean,
They
there
forgot.
are plenty of... Yeah, they forgot about it, right?
You see that? So she's asking why not all remembered the flood. And if you've watched the Babel Tower challenge, or if you've watched my video, Mike in the Tower, you're familiar with what the problem is here. And part of the problem with the classic exposition of the tower is that not all the peoples of the earth are included in the Table of Nations. The Hebrews knew of other peoples that simply aren't listed in the Table of Nations. Now, why is that? Folks, it's because the table wasn't intended to tell you where the world population came from. That's not the purpose of the table. The purpose of the table is to tell you the people who received Edenic families from the Babel dispersion. It's not all the peoples of the earth that received an Edenic family. That's why it's not exhaustive. That comes out in my notes on page 7 again. But so Erica has some really good questions coming up about this stuff. And these are questions that have been around. They reflect the questions raised by Driver so long ago. And he wasn't the first one to raise those points. I just used him in my other video because I love Driver so much. So I was like, he puts it so perfectly too. So I used Driver to make my point in the Babel Tower challenge. The objections go back long before Driver. People have known about these problems for a long time. If you understand the Tower of Babel correctly, though, then you see the answer. And it's so simple. It's just been in front of your face the whole time.
There's a meme. There's a meme that I find very amusing where you have, I think it's statues, like Sumerian statuette from the Eye Temple, maybe, I can't remember. But anyway, they're set up and it says, in the middle of the 3rd millennium or 6,000 years ago or something, the Sumerians looked on in amazement as the world was destroyed by a flood. You know, like,
Yeah.
because
I was just going to ask you about that. Is that the dates? So
Yeah.
I looked up if you actually do the math in the Bible, the flood happens in 2472 BC.
Yeah.
Now, you're an Assyriologist. you're as qualified as it comes to the history of Sumeria, Assyria, Babylon, whatever. What was happening at that time in Babylon?
I mean, you're talking about a period where you're sort of transitioning. I mean, you know, there's some fluctuation in the dates, obviously, but this is a period where the early dynastic period is sort of drawing to a close, and we're getting ready to see the rise of Sargon of Akkad.
So there's no great flood happening at this time.
We have lots of documentation,
hence the meme
from the middle of
that
the
you
third
just
millennium.
mentioned, which is why the meme is like, wait a minute, look, a flood around the rest of the world, but we're fine, we're thriving. We're about to go into a new period.
But what is so damning about this? I think his name is Jonathan Choi. I can't remember, but Choi, his last name is Choi, wrote a book 2011, 12, something like that. It essentially, what he's doing is he's looking at the Mesopotamian flood traditions to figure out when they started. And, you know, there's pretty good evidence that we don't have the flood tradition until the beginning of the second millennium. In other words, 500 years later than, you know, the middle of the third millennium. So essentially what you have, so there are a couple of things that we look at. There's a text called the Sumerian King List. And you guys probably are familiar with it, but it's a pretty simple Sumerian text, but it just talks about, you know, kingship comes down from heaven and it goes into this city. And so this city rules, and here are the kings, and they rule for 165,000 years. And then, you know, kingship moves to this other city and so on. But there are different versions of it, and we have them. We have the, you know, the different versions from different time periods. And we have a Sumerian king list extant from the end of the third millennium. And it doesn't have this flood tradition in it. There's a part of the Sumerian king list that says, then the flood swept over. It doesn't show up in the third millennium text. It does show up in the second millennium text. And that's when, during this old Babylonian period, all these Sumerian and then ultimately Akkadian flood stories start showing up. So what you end up having to argue, if you're on the side of, you know, there's this one major event that just all the different civilizations are remembering and writing their own version, that the Sumerians had a worldwide flood, even a regional flood that covered all of Mesopotamia. They had this. It destroyed it. It left no evidence whatsoever in the written record. Like, you can go look at cuneiform tablets all throughout the third millennium. Nothing. No mention of it for 500 years. And then they start writing about it.
So were you able to follow Josh's argument there? That, by the way, was Dr. Josh Bowen. He's an Assyriologist. Did you understand the point he was trying to make? Let me present my own sort of argument for the classic exposition. Okay, what he was saying is that if we use a Hebrew date for the flood, which I would use, I'm not sure why they're using that, but I would use a Hebrew date. Yes, indeed, it would be sometime here. 2435 is where I have it. See that? Okay. Now what Josh is saying is that for some reason we only find the flood and so forth beginning to be discussed here. Okay. And he mentions the Sumerian king list. I have a late date here of a complete king's list, but it would seem that the antediluvian portion of the king list, the pre-flood portion of the king list, that seems to have been composed at a later time and attached to the front of the king list. And there's a lot involved in looking at that, but that has all been thoroughly discussed in Jacobson's book, The King List, okay? And I will link this below so you can take a look for yourself. But yeah, he's basically pointing out, if the flood happened here, why is there silence for some time? Then they talk about it in their histories. And let me go a little further than that. I would say we know these people in southern Mesopotamia here. We know this history going back into extremely early times. Okay? The Uruk period is back here. This is a long time ago. So when we're talking the Mesopotamian culture, we're talking about people who archaeologically we know about long before they record a flood. That's something to understand, okay? Something Dr. Bowen's bringing out is that the alleged flood was here, but it's not recorded till here. He finds that odd. And I would say that generally the evidence as we have it just doesn't fit the classic exposition very well, okay? And this is a key area right here where you're going to need to understand the tower correctly. Let me show you what I mean. After the flood, which was in Eretz Eden, it wasn't in Eretz Shinar, it wasn't in Eretz Cush, it wasn't in Eretz Havilah, it wasn't in Eretz Nod. These are other Eretzes in the early Genesis narrative. The flood wasn't in those lands. It was in the land of Eden, the Eretz, the homeland, Eden. That's where it was. After the flood, and the ark landed on Mount Zion, by the way, and not Mount Ararat. I'll get into that sometime. After the flood, about 100 years later, roughly, there was the tower episode. Now, the Edenic clan at that point was scattered apart and mixed into the surrounding world populations. That means that over the course of this time here, the memories from Eden were absorbed into the national history of the various nations. So the evidence you see on your screen is just what I would expect to see when you understand the tower correctly. It's just what I would expect to see, although it befuddles those that follow the traditional exposition.
And then you got to factor in, after the flood, you get supposedly 3 sons: Shem, Japheth, and Cain. What is it? Cain or Shem, Ham,
and Japheth. Yeah.
So you got 3 men to populate the whole world by a certain period of time. So we compare it to other history, right? Let's say we know a population of Egypt in 1500 BC. Right? Let's just throw that out there. So now you're saying for a 500-year span, roughly 600 years, you have 3 people populating the whole Earth to this number within a couple centuries, 5 centuries.
No, that is not the meaning. And that's where the traditional exposition goes wrong. You can tell. You can just see all the problems beginning, can't you? The tower is huge, folks. You've got to understand it right to figure this all out.
I mean, it's all. I mentioned this. I did a stream, I don't know, earlier this year, on Paulogia's channel, and we talked about this very topic, this aspect of the topic, and it ended up being that, because again, it's not just the fact that you don't see anything in the writing. It's not just that you don't see anything in the archaeology. It's that, as you're saying, if you end up with 8 people, you've got like 20 years to create enough people to have the Sargonic Empire
Right.
in 20 years. I mean, what's that now?
That's crazy to think about, and that's not that complex for someone to grasp.
No.
It's not just that, too. They have to spread out all over the surface of the Earth, and in a very short amount of time, they have to make the ziggurats of South America. They have to do the big monoliths that we see over in China. They've got to make it over and do Clovic stuff in North America. It's all this stuff happening simultaneously. And it's funny because if you go to Answers in Genesis, they'll give you a nice exponential growth number to give you enough people just to deal with the pyramids that are coming shortly after that flood date. But here, the burning question of that is, if that exponential growth rate were to continue, we wouldn't have we would be packed person to person on this planet today if the growth rate had continued at that unabated rate. So really, it seems like what they're arguing is that after the flood, everyone was getting busy and women were just having litters of children, like litters of 9-10 kids to populate the earth in time. And then once the monoliths are up, the worldwide monoliths are up, everyone just stops. Like the libido just plummets. Like it's just no one is having kids anymore. And they're kind of just okay with saying that.
Such are the absurdities that arise from the traditional exposition. It's not the meaning of the tower. Churchendom has it all wrong. So this is my buddy Mark out in the Netherlands, and he understands the tower. Once you understand the tower, you can answer all kinds of things. All kinds of things. It's tremendous. It's tremendous. So you really need to get the tower right, folks. And here's something else to think about. Now, I, of course, hold an old Earth view. But even if you're a young Earth creationist, you're going to want to get the tower right. And you're going to want to be pre-Adamite, even from a young Earth creationist view. Okay? Say you have an initial creation in Genesis 1, just 1,000 years before God makes Adam in the garden, a garden temple. A young Earth creationist is still going to need to look at it this way. Because what happens to the Adenic clan, at the end of their story, they get scattered apart and mixed into other people. So you're going to need these other people whose origin is provided in Genesis 1 and who were not killed off by any global flood at all, and who then absorbed the Adenic clan in chapter 11. Regardless of whether you're young Earth or old Earth, you're going to need to hold this idea to make sense of Genesis 1 to 11. It functions as a unit, and that's the only way to understand it properly. You've got to be pre-Adamite and understand the tower correctly. And it doesn't matter what position you hold, you need to incorporate this thinking into it in order to make everything work. You might have to think about this a little bit before it clicks, but I'm sure it will. Think it through. I'm being serious. And this is perhaps the most tremendous thing I can ever share with anyone. I'm so thrilled that Mark has it. I hope other people get it too. It's tremendous, folks. You really need to understand the tower. So big.